Bruno's entire body had gone rigid. Lips curled back from his teeth, a low growl rumbling from somewhere deep in his chest. Officer Garrett Hollins had worked with the German Shepherd for 3 years, through armed standoffs and drug busts, and crowd control situations that would make most people's knees buckle. And he had never seen his partner react like this to a piece of paper. The drawing lay on the precinct's front gate, where it had been tucked through the chain link, fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. Bright crayon colors, wobbly lines, a child's work, unmistakably. But Bruno stood between Garrett and that innocent-looking sketch like it was a loaded weapon, hackles raised, every muscle coiled and ready to strike. "Easy, boy," Garrett murmured, crouching slowly beside the canine. "It's just a picture." But even as he said it, something cold settled in his stomach. Because Bruno didn't react like this. Not to drawings, not to anything unless there was real danger, and the dog's instincts had never been wrong before. Garrett's hand hovered over the paper, and Bruno's growl deepened, turning sharp and urgent. A warning, the kind of sound the shepherd made when he detected explosives or caught the scent of something poisonous, something that could hurt people if they got too close. Garrett's fingers froze an inch from the crayon marks. The morning shift was starting to filter into the parking lot behind him, car doors slamming, voices calling greetings across the asphalt. Normal sounds. A normal Tuesday in a quiet suburban precinct, where the biggest problems were usually theft reports and traffic disputes. But here at the gate, with Bruno's teeth bared and his own pulse starting to hammer against his ribs, Garrett felt the air itself shift into something heavier. He pulled his hand back slowly, then reached instead for a pair of latex gloves from his belt kit. Bruno tracked the movement, ears pinned flat, but the growl softened just slightly when Garrett didn't touch the paper barehanded. Smart dog. Always the smartest dog in any room. Garrett snapped the gloves on, then carefully lifted the drawing from where it had been wedged between the gate's metal bars. The moment the paper moved, Bruno lunged forward half a step, snapping at the air, and Garrett nearly dropped it. "Bruno, heel," Garrett said sharply, and the command cut through the dog's aggression just enough to pull him back. But the shepherd didn't sit, didn't relax, just stood there vibrating with tension, eyes locked on the drawing like it might attack at any moment. Garrett turned the paper over in his hands, and his breath caught. It was one of Mila's drawings. The little girl had been leaving pictures for Bruno for 3 weeks now, ever since she'd seen them on patrol near her elementary school, and decided the police dog needed art to brighten his day. Garrett had watched the routine develop with quiet amusement. Mila walking past the precinct on her way home, carefully sliding a new drawing through the gate, then waving at Bruno if he happened to be outside. The pictures were always cheerful. Stick figure Bruno with a wagging tail, hearts and flowers, sunshine and rainbows. Garrett had started keeping them in his locker, a small collection of childhood innocence that reminded him why he wore the badge in the first place. But this drawing was different. Garrett's eyes traced the crayon lines, and the cold feeling in his stomach spread outward into his chest. Mila had drawn her house. He recognized the blue shutters and the maple tree in the front yard from the route he sometimes took on patrol. She'd drawn herself too, a stick figure with yellow yarn hair, holding what looked like a backpack. And there, in the center of the page, drawn with careful detail that didn't match the rest of the wobbly sketch, a white van. Not just any van. Mila had drawn it with windows tinted dark, parked on the street near her house. She'd added something else too, something that made Garrett's throat tighten. On the side of the van, in careful blocky letters, a 6-year-old had clearly copied from real life. She'd written partial license plate numbers, T.4.K.9. 4 characters visible, the rest obscured, or maybe too hard for small hands to remember. And inside the van, barely visible through the crayon-scribbled tint of the windows, a stick figure, an adult, watching the little girl's house. Garrett's hands started to shake. He forced himself to keep looking, to see every detail. Mila had drawn the stick figure inside the van with dark eyes, big eyes, staring eyes. She'd used black crayon to color them in, pressing hard enough that the wax had torn through the paper in places. The kind of pressure a child used when something scared them, when they were trying to show something important, something wrong, but didn't have the words to explain it. At the bottom of the page, in the same careful printing she'd used for the license numbers, Mila had written a sentence. The letters wobbled and some were backwards, but the message was clear enough to stop Garrett's heart. He looks at me every day. Bruno growled again, and this time Garrett understood. This wasn't just a drawing, it was a cry for help. A 6-year-old's only way to tell someone that something was very, very wrong on her walk home from school. She'd brought it to the one protector she knew, the police dog who'd been kind to her, who'd wagged his tail and accepted her gifts of crayon art. And somehow, impossibly, Bruno had known from the moment he caught the scent of this paper that it carried danger. Garrett's mind raced, clicking through protocols and procedures, but underneath all the training was a single screaming thought. Mila was in trouble, right now, today. Because if someone had been watching her every day, studying her routine, parking where they could see her house. He looked at the date in the corner of the drawing, the way Mila's teacher probably required the kids to mark all their schoolwork. Today's date. She'd made this last night or this morning, which meant the van was still out there. The watcher was still out there. And in just a few hours, when school let out, Mila would walk past that vehicle again, alone and small and trusting, not understanding that the person inside those tinted windows wasn't just looking, they were hunting. Garrett stood up fast enough to make his vision swim, the drawing clutched carefully in his gloved hands. Bruno pressed against his leg immediately, still bristling, still ready. Around them the precinct was waking up fully now, officers heading toward the building, radios crackling to life, the ordinary machinery of law enforcement grinding into motion for another ordinary day. But nothing about this was ordinary. Garrett started toward the building at a near run, Bruno matching him stride for stride. His supervisor needed to see this. Child services needed to be called. Every unit in the district needed to start looking for a white van with T4K and 9 in the plate. And he needed to get to Mila's neighborhood before 3 o'clock, before the school buses started dropping kids off, before a little girl with yellow hair and a trusting heart walked past a predator who'd been patient enough to watch and wait and plan. The drawing crinkled slightly in his grip as he yanked open the precinct door. Behind him, morning sunlight caught the crayon marks and made them glow. A child's artwork that had just become the most important piece of evidence Garrett had ever held. Sergeant Lydia Carver looked up from her desk as Garrett burst through the door of her office, Bruno still glued to his side and radiating aggression like heat off asphalt. She'd been a patrol supervisor for 12 years, long enough to read urgency in an officer's face before he spoke. And what she saw in Garrett's expression made her stand up immediately. "Talk to me," she said, already reaching for her radio. Garrett placed the drawing on her desk with both hands, careful not to let it crumple, and stepped back so she could see it clearly. Bruno moved with him, eyes never leaving the paper, a low, continuous rumble still vibrating through his chest. Lydia leaned over the desk, scanning the crayon lines, and Garrett watched her face shift from confusion to understanding, to the same cold dread that was currently eating through his own stomach lining. "How long has the child been leaving drawings?" Lydia's voice stayed level, professional, but her hand had tightened around her radio hard enough to whiten her knuckles. 3 weeks, Garrett said. "Started mid-September. Her name's Mila Chen. She's 6, lives about 8 blocks east of here on Maple Ridge Drive. She walks home from Riverside Elementary most days. Her mom's a nurse, works day shifts at County General, so Mila stays with a neighbor until she gets home around 6. The neighbor's elderly, doesn't always walk down to meet the bus." He realized he knew more about Mila's routine than he'd consciously registered, the details filing themselves away during weeks of casual patrol observations. A little girl who liked to draw, who waved at police dogs, who walked the same route every afternoon with her backpack bouncing and her yellow hair catching the light. vulnerable in ways she didn't understand and couldn't protect herself from. Lydia picked up her desk phone and punched in an extension, her eyes still on the drawing. I need to speak with someone from Child Protective Services immediately. Active threat situation involving a minor. She paused, listening, then her voice went harder. I don't care about callback times. Get someone on the line or get me a supervisor, now. While she waited, she looked at Garrett again. Bruno reacted to the paper itself. Before I even touched it, Garrett confirmed. Full threat response. I've never seen him react to a drawing before. To anything unless there was actual danger present. Lydia nodded slowly, and Garrett saw her fitting the pieces together the same way he had. Canine units didn't train their dogs to detect emotional distress on paper, but sometimes the animals picked up things anyway. Scent markers humans couldn't perceive, chemical traces, or maybe just some instinct that ran deeper than training. The same ancient wiring that let wolves know when prey was injured or when something in their territory posed a threat to the pack. Maybe Mila had cried while drawing it. Maybe her fear had soaked into the paper on a molecular level, and Bruno's nose had caught what Garrett's eyes couldn't see. Or maybe the shepherd just understood what the image meant, the way some dogs seem to read pictures and screens with an intelligence that made handlers uncomfortable if they thought about it too long. Either way, Bruno had known, and Bruno was never wrong. A voice crackled through Lydia's phone, and she started talking rapidly, explaining the situation in the clipped shorthand of law enforcement communication. Garrett only half listened, his attention caught by the drawing again. Mila had used bright colors for everything except the van and the watching figure. Her house was blue and yellow. The tree was green with brown bark. Even her stick figure self wore a red shirt and carried a purple backpack. But the van was white, empty white, just the outline traced in black crayon, and the figure inside was nothing but shadow and those terrible pressing hard black eyes. A child's instinct for color as emotion, brightness for safety, for home and normal things. Emptiness and darkness for the thing that didn't belong, the thing that scared her. Lydia hung up and immediately started writing on a notepad, her pen moving fast. CPS is sending someone to the school right now to pull Mila out of class and interview her. They'll keep her there until we have more information. I'm putting out a bolo for the van. White, partial plates starting with T, possibly T4K9 or some variation. Tinted windows, likely surveillance activity in the Maple Ridge area. She looked up at Garrett, and her expression had shifted into something harder, something that reminded him why she'd made sergeant before she turned 30. You're going to take Bruno and drive that route. All of it. The school, the walking path Mila takes home, every block between here and her house. If that van is parked somewhere watching, I want to know about it 5 minutes ago. Garrett nodded, his hand already dropping to Bruno's head. The shepherd leaned into the touch, some of the tension finally bleeding out of his muscles now that the humans were taking action. What about the mother? I'll have someone contact her at the hospital, bring her in to talk to CPS with Mila. She needs to know what's happening before the rumor mill gets hold of it. Lydia picked up the drawing carefully, holding it by the edges the way Garrett had. I'm sending this to forensics. If there's anything on this paper, prints, DNA, anything, we're going to find it. Garrett felt something loosen slightly in his chest. The machinery of response was moving now, all the training and systems kicking into gear. Mila would be safe at school, surrounded by adults who'd been alerted to watch her. Her mother would be contacted. Every patrol unit would be looking for the van. It wasn't enough yet, not until they found the watcher and put him somewhere he couldn't hurt anyone. But it was movement, progress, action instead of just fear. He turned toward the door, Bruno already moving with him, and Lydia's voice stopped him before he reached the hallway. Garrett. He looked back. She was still holding the drawing, backlit by the fluorescent office lights, and her face had softened just slightly. That little girl is smart. She knew something was wrong, and she found a way to ask for help. She picked the right protector to ask. Garrett's throat tightened. He thought about Mila carefully drawing those license plate letters, trying so hard to get them right. Thought about her pressing down hard with the black crayon to show the watching eyes, her small hands shaking maybe, but determined to make the adults understand. Thought about her walking past that van, day after day, feeling those eyes on her, feeling the wrongness of it, and having no one to tell except a police dog who'd wagged his tail at her a few times. She shouldn't have had to ask at all, he said quietly. Lydia nodded. No, she shouldn't have. But she did, and now we know. So let's make sure the bastard watching her doesn't get another chance. Garrett pushed through the door into the hallway, Bruno's nails clicking on the linoleum beside him. Other officers were arriving for shift change, voices echoing off the walls, someone laughing at a joke near the coffee station. Normal sounds. Normal morning. But Garrett moved through it all like a stone through water, his mind already on Maple Ridge Drive, on tinted windows and patient predators, and a 6-year-old girl who'd drawn a picture instead of screaming, because she'd thought the picture might be enough. It would be enough. He'd make sure of it. The precinct's back door opened onto the motor pool, and Garrett headed for his patrol unit at a jog. Bruno jumped into the back compartment without needing a command, his body still tight and focused, still ready, still knowing that the hunt wasn't over yet. Garrett slid behind the wheel and started the engine, his eyes already tracking the route in his mind. 8 blocks east, the elementary school, the walking path, every parked vehicle, every tinted window, every white van that might be hiding something terrible behind ordinary sheet metal and glass. His radio crackled to life as Lydia's voice came through, broadcasting the bolo to all units. Be advised, we are looking for a white van, partial plate Tango 4 Kilo 9, possibly engaged in surveillance of a minor near Riverside Elementary. Vehicle may be occupied. Approach with caution and report any sightings immediately. Garrett pulled out of the parking lot, lights off, but adrenaline spiking through his bloodstream like electricity. In the rearview mirror, he could see Bruno's reflection, the shepherd's eyes fixed forward, ears up, every line of his body saying the same thing Garrett's instincts were screaming. Find it. Find it now. Before 3 o'clock. Before the school buses. Before a little girl with yellow hair walked into a nightmare that had been waiting for her to make one wrong step, one moment of inattention, one afternoon when no one was watching closely enough. But someone was watching now. And that someone wasn't going to let Mila walk past that van ever again. Riverside Elementary sat at the corner of Oak and 14th, a low brick building surrounded by playground equipment and a chain-link fence that was supposed to make parents feel safe. Garrett drove past it slowly, scanning every vehicle parked along the curb, every shadow that might hide a waiting predator. Morning recess was in full swing, children's voices carrying across the asphalt in bright bursts of laughter and shouting. Innocent sounds, the sounds of kids who didn't know that sometimes people watch them for all the wrong reasons. No white van, not here, not yet. He continued east along Mila's walking route, the path she would take in just a few hours when the bell rang and the buses started loading. Past the corner store with its faded awning and racks of newspapers. Past the vacant lot where someone had dumped an old sofa months ago and nobody had bothered to haul it away. Past houses with neat lawns and houses with overgrown gardens, and houses where curtains stayed drawn all day because the people inside worked nights or didn't care what the neighborhood looked like anymore. Bruno's breathing had changed in the back compartment, gone sharper and faster, and Garrett glanced in the mirror to see the shepherd pressed against the metal grate that separated them. Focused, hunting. The dog knew they were looking for something, could probably smell the tension rolling off Garrett's skin, could sense the urgency in every turn of the wheel. Maple Ridge Drive came into view 2 minutes later, a quiet residential street lined with maples that were just starting to turn gold at the edges. Garrett's pulse kicked up another notch as he slowed the patrol unit to a crawl, his eyes moving methodically from one side of the street to the other. Sedans, SUVs, a pickup truck with contractor logos on the side, a Toyota with a child safety seat visible through the back window. Normal vehicles, normal neighborhood. Nothing that matched the description from Mila's drawing. He was 3 houses past the Chen residence. He recognized it from the blue shutters and the maple tree Mila had sketched so carefully. when Bruno erupted into barking. Not the alert bark the shepherd used during training exercises. Not the warning bark that meant someone was approaching the vehicle. This was the sound Bruno made when he'd found contraband during a search, when his nose had locked onto something illegal or dangerous, and every instinct in his body demanded that the humans pay attention right now. Garrett hit the brakes hard enough to make the tires chirp, his head whipping around to follow Bruno's line of sight. The shepherd was lunging against the grate, teeth bared, focused on something behind them. Back toward the Chen house. Back toward there. 2 blocks down, parked on the opposite side of the street under the shadow of an oak tree that hadn't been trimmed in years. A white van, paneled sides, tinted windows that turned the glass into dark mirrors reflecting nothing. Nondescript except for the way it sat there like a held breath, like something waiting. Garrett's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles cracked. He pulled the patrol unit to the curb and grabbed his binoculars from the center console, his movements smooth and controlled despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. Behind him, Bruno was still barking, still throwing his body weight against the grate in his desperation to get out, to close the distance between himself and the threat he'd identified. "Easy," Garrett murmured, though he didn't know if he was talking to the dog or himself. "Easy. I see it." He brought the binoculars up and focused on the van's rear plate. The angle was wrong, partially obscured by the oak's low-hanging branches, but he could make out enough. White background, blue letters, Tango, something, Kilo, 9, T4K9. Exactly what Mila had written on her drawing. Exactly what a 6-year-old girl had copied down, because she'd walked past this vehicle enough times to memorize the letters. Because something in her child's instinct had recognized danger, even if she didn't have the words to name it. Garrett lowered the binoculars and reached for his radio, but before he could key the mic, movement inside the van caught his attention. A shadow shifting behind the tinted driver's side window. Someone was in there, sitting, waiting, watching the street, with a clear view of the Chen house and the sidewalk where Mila would appear in a few hours. Backpack bouncing, yellow hair catching the afternoon sun, completely unaware that she'd been selected and studied and stalked. His finger pressed the radio button, and his voice came out steady despite the fury building behind his ribs. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I have visual on the Bolo vehicle. White van, confirmed partial plate, Tango 4 Kilo 9. Location is Maple Ridge Drive, 200 block, south side. Vehicle is occupied. Requesting immediate backup." The dispatcher's response crackled back within seconds, professional and clipped. "Copy that, Unit 12. Backup is en route. ETA 4 minutes. Stand by and maintain visual." 4 minutes. Garrett's eyes stayed locked on the van, watching for any sign that the driver had noticed the patrol unit. Any indication that he might bolt. But the vehicle didn't move. The shadow inside remained still. Either the watcher was confident enough not to panic at the sight of a cop car, or he was so focused on his surveillance that he hadn't registered the danger yet. Bruno's barking had dropped to a continuous low growl, punctuated by sharp whines that meant the shepherd wanted out of the compartment now, wanted to do his job, wanted to put teeth into the threat that had triggered every protective instinct bred into his bloodline. Garrett understood the feeling. His own hands were shaking slightly, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, because he was looking at the thing every parent feared and every cop dreaded, a predator in plain sight, hiding behind tinted glass and patience, waiting for the perfect moment to turn a child's normal day into a nightmare that would never fully end. Mila had seen this van every day, had walked past it, had felt those eyes on her. And instead of being taught to ignore her instincts, instead of being told she was imagining things or being silly, she'd found a way to document what scared her. She'd drawn it out in crayon and brought it to the one protector she thought might understand. She'd been right. Garrett's radio crackled again, and Lydia's voice came through, tight with controlled urgency. "Unit 12, backup is 1 minute out. Do not approach the vehicle until support arrives. Repeat, maintain position and do not engage. "Copy," Garrett said, but his hand was already moving to his duty belt, checking his weapon, his cuffs, his radio. Standard pre-contact ritual. The movements his body knew how to make when action was coming and hesitation could cost lives. In the rearview mirror, he saw two patrol units turning onto Maple Ridge from opposite ends of the street, moving fast, but without lights or sirens. Silent approach. The kind of tactical response that didn't give suspects time to react or escape. One unit pulled up behind Garrett. The other continued forward and angled across the street, boxing the van in with professional precision. Officers emerged from both vehicles, hands on weapons, body language radiating authority and readiness. Garrett recognized Torres and McKinnon from the day shift, both veterans who'd worked everything from domestic disputes to gang task force operations. Good people to have at your back when you were about to confront a predator. Garrett opened his door and stepped out, then moved to the back compartment and released Bruno. The shepherd exploded from the vehicle like a missile, but Garrett's hand was already on his collar, holding him steady. "Heel," he commanded, and Bruno dropped into position immediately, every muscle coiled and quivering, but obeying the order. Waiting for permission to do what he'd been born and trained to do: protect. Garrett looked at Torres and McKinnon, then at the white van sitting under the oak tree's shadow, at the tinted windows hiding whoever was inside, at the vehicle that had been parked 2 blocks from a little girl's house, watching and waiting and planning something that would never happen now. "Let's go," Garrett said quietly, and started walking. The distance between Garrett's patrol unit and the white van felt like walking through deep water. Every step stretched and slowed, his boots striking pavement in a rhythm that matched the hammering of his pulse against his ribs. Torres and McKinnon moved with him, forming a tactical triangle with Garrett at the point, their hands resting on holstered weapons, but not drawing yet. Not until they knew what they were dealing with. Not until the threat became action instead of potential. Bruno strained against Garrett's grip, pulling forward with enough force to make Garrett's shoulder ache. The shepherd's entire focus locked on the van like a laser sight. The growl rumbling through the dog's chest had dropped into a frequency Garrett could feel more than hear. A vibration of pure protective aggression that made the hair on his arms stand up despite 3 years of working beside this animal every single day. They were 20 feet away when the van's driver's side door opened. Garrett's hand moved to his weapon instantly, muscle memory taking over, but he didn't draw. Not yet. Because the man stepping out of the van looked ordinary. Mid-40s maybe, average height, receding hairline, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt like he might be an insurance adjuster or a real estate agent taking a lunch break. The kind of face that disappeared in crowds. The kind of person who could sit in a parked van for hours and never register as anything worth noticing, which was exactly what made him dangerous. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them and step away from the vehicle," Garrett said, his voice carrying the flat, authoritative tone that left no room for questions or negotiation. The man's eyes flicked from Garrett to Torres to McKinnon, then down to Bruno, who was vibrating with barely controlled violence at Garrett's side. Something shifted in the man's expression. Not fear exactly, but calculation. The look of someone running numbers in his head, weighing options, deciding whether cooperation or resistance offered better odds. His hands came up slowly, palms out, and he took 2 steps away from the van. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We received a report of suspicious activity in this area," Torres said, moving to flank the suspect's right side while McKinnon circled left. Standard positioning, controlling space, making sure the man couldn't bolt back to the van or pass them into the residential street beyond. "Can I see some identification?" The man reached slowly toward his back pocket, and Garrett's grip on his weapon tightened, but all that emerged was a worn leather wallet. The man pulled out a driver's license and extended it toward Torres with steady fingers. No shaking, no nervous sweat. Either he was innocent, or he'd been in situations like this before and knew how to perform calm. Torres glanced at the license, then back at the man's face. "Carl Vickers, is this your current address, Mr. Vickers?" "Yes, sir." "You live in Riverside?" About 3 miles west of here, yes. McKinnon had moved closer to the van now, shining his flashlight through the tinted rear windows, trying to see inside without touching the vehicle. Garrett kept his attention split between Vickers and his partner's movements, reading body language, watching for tells. Vickers' eyes followed McKinnon, and there, just for a second, his jaw tightened, barely visible, the kind of micro-expression that only showed up when someone was trying very hard not to react to something. "What brings you to this neighborhood, Mr. Vickers?" Garrett asked, and Bruno lunged forward another inch, snapping at the air between them. Vickers took an involuntary step back, and Garrett saw his Adam's apple bob in a hard swallow. Good. Let him be afraid. Let him understand that the animal at the end of this leash could read guilt better than any polygraph ever built. I was just taking a break," Vickers said, and now there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I work from home sometimes, drive around to clear my head." "For how long?" Torres pressed. "How long have you been parked on this street?" Vickers hesitated, and in that hesitation Garrett saw everything he needed to know. Because innocent people who were just taking a break didn't have to calculate how long they'd been sitting in one place. They didn't have to weigh their answer against what the cops might already know, or what might sound suspicious. They just answered. "I don't know," Vickers finally said. "Maybe 20 minutes?" McKinnon straightened up from the van's windows and looked at Garrett, his expression grim. He tilted his head slightly, a signal they'd used 100 times before. Whatever he'd seen inside, it wasn't good. "Mr. Vickers," Garrett said carefully, "I'm going to need you to consent to a search of your vehicle." Vickers' hands dropped slightly, no longer held quite as high, and his weight shifted back on his heels. Classic pre-flight posture, the body getting ready to run before the brain made the conscious decision. I don't think I have to do that. Don't you need a warrant?" "Not if you give permission," Torres said. "And if you have nothing to hide. I want to call my lawyer." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Garrett felt something cold and certain settle in his chest. Because that was it. That was the line that separated people who were annoyed by police attention from people who knew they were guilty of something worth hiding. Bruno erupted into full barking again, throwing his body weight against Garrett's grip hard enough to drag him forward a step. The shepherd's teeth were fully bared now, foam flecking his jaws, every line of his body screaming, "Threat, threat, threat," in a language older than words or laws. And Vickers broke. He spun toward the van's open door, hands reaching for the handle, body moving with desperate speed. But Torres was already there, catching Vickers's arm and wrenching it back behind his spine with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd made 1,000 arrests and knew exactly how much pressure to apply. Vickers struggled for maybe 3 seconds before Torres had him face down on the asphalt, cuffs clicking into place around his wrists, Miranda rights being recited in that same flat, authoritative tone that meant the time for questions was over. McKinnon moved to the van immediately, pulling the rear doors open wide, and Garrett followed with Bruno still straining at his collar. What he saw inside made his vision narrow to a tunnel, made his breath stick in his throat like broken glass. Photographs, dozens of them, taped to the inside walls of the van, covering nearly every surface. And every single picture showed the same subject: Mila Chen, walking home from school, sitting on her front porch, playing in her yard, getting off the bus, always alone, always photographed from a distance with a telephoto lens that captured details no casual observer should have known. The gap between her front teeth when she smiled, the way her backpack had a small tear on one strap, the exact pattern of freckles across her nose. Study photos, surveillance documentation, the kind of meticulous record-keeping that spoke to planning and patience and intent that went far beyond opportunistic impulse. But it was the back corner of the van that made Garrett's hands shake. Zip ties, duct tape, a blanket folded neat and ready, a child's juice box sitting in a cup holder, still cold to the touch, condensation beading on the outside, bait or provision. Either way, preparation for something that had been scheduled to happen very soon. Jesus Christ, McKinnon breathed beside him, and Garrett heard the same horror in his partner's voice that was currently clawing through his own chest. On the asphalt behind them, Vickers had gone completely still, no longer struggling, just lying there with his cheek pressed against the pavement and his eyes closed. Caught. Whatever plans he'd been building for weeks or months, whatever moment he'd been waiting for, it was over now. Garrett looked down at Bruno, at the shepherd who'd known from the first second that Mila's drawing carried danger, who'd reacted with violence to crayon marks on paper because somehow his instincts had reached across the gap between what was drawn and what it represented. The dog's barking had subsided now, dropping back into that low, continuous growl, but his eyes never left Vickers's prone form. Still watching, still ready. "Good boy," Garrett said quietly, and his voice cracked on the words. "Good boy, Bruno." Torres was already on his radio, calling for additional units and a crime scene team. McKinnon had started photographing the van's interior with his phone, documenting every detail before anything could be disturbed or disputed in court later. Standard procedure. The machinery of justice grinding into motion around a predator who'd made the mistake of hunting a child smart enough and brave enough to draw what scared her. Garrett pulled his own radio and keyed the mic, his eyes still on those photographs, on the evidence of weeks of stalking that had come within hours, maybe minutes, of becoming something no amount of police work could ever undo. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Suspect is in custody. We're going to need CPS and detectives at this location immediately. And someone contact Riverside Elementary. Tell them Mila Chen is safe. Tell them she's safe, and she can go home when her mother gets there." His voice held steady through the transmission, but when he lowered the radio, his hands were shaking hard enough that he had to grip Bruno's collar with both fists just to keep them still. Because 3 o'clock was still 2 hours away. 2 hours before Mila would have walked past this van, backpack bouncing, yellow hair catching the light, trusting that the world was a safe place because 6-year-olds were supposed to be able to trust that. And she would have been wrong, so terribly, permanently wrong. But she wasn't, because she'd drawn a picture, because she'd brought it to a police dog who'd understood somehow that it mattered, because Bruno had refused to let that drawing be dismissed as just another piece of childhood art. Garrett looked at the photographs again, at Mila's face captured in moment after moment of innocent routine, and felt something fierce and protective surge through his chest. She would never have to see these pictures, would never have to know how close the nightmare had come. Her mother would know, the justice system would know, but Mila herself can stay a child just a little bit longer. That was something. That was everything. Riverside Elementary's main office smelled like floor wax and the industrial-strength coffee that kept secretaries functional through 6-hour stretches of ringing phones and scraped knees. Garrett pushed through the double doors with Bruno at his side, the shepherd's demeanor completely transformed from the aggressive protector who'd been ready to tear Vickers apart just an hour ago. Now Bruno moved with careful gentleness, his ears relaxed, his tail wagging in slow, measured sweeps that signaled safety and calm to anyone watching. The school's principal met them in the hallway, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who'd worked in elementary education for 20 years and had probably seen every kind of crisis a school could face. But the expression on her face suggested this one had rattled her more than most. "Officer Garrett," she said quietly, her eyes flicking to Bruno and then back. "Mila and her mother are in the counseling office. CPS finished their initial interview about 15 minutes ago. Mrs. Chen she's understandably upset." Garrett nodded, his chest tightening at the thought of what Mila's mother must be feeling right now. The guilt, the terror that came from learning how close danger had circled around your child while you were at work, doing everything right, trusting that a quiet neighborhood and a short walk home were safe enough. Trusting that the world wouldn't reach out and try to steal your baby when you weren't looking. "Has Mila been told what happened?" he asked. Patricia shook her head. "Only that the person who'd been watching her has been arrested and won't be able to bother her anymore. We kept it simple. age-appropriate. The CPS counselor was very good about that. She paused, then added softly, "But Mila keeps asking if Bruno is okay. She seems worried that she got him in trouble by bringing him the drawing." Something broke open in Garrett's chest, the image of a 6-year-old girl, scared enough to document danger, but still worried that she might have caused problems for the dog who'd helped her. The kind of backward child logic that put everyone else's feelings before her own fear. "Can we see her?" Garrett asked. Patricia nodded and led them down the hallway toward the administrative wing, past construction paper artwork taped to walls and bulletin boards celebrating perfect attendance and book reports. Normal school things, the everyday scaffolding of childhood that was supposed to be simple and safe and unmarred by the knowledge that monsters sometimes wore khakis and drove white vans and watched from shadows. The counseling office door was partially open, and through the gap, Garrett could see a woman sitting in one of the small chairs designed for children, her body folded forward with her face in her hands. Mrs. Chen, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, scrub still on from her hospital shift, shoulders shaking with silent sobs she was trying very hard to muffle. And beside her, in another tiny chair, sat Mila. Yellow hair in 2 braids, freckles across her nose, a purple backpack at her feet with a small tear on one strap. The same backpack Vickers had photographed, the same detail he'd studied and recorded. But Mila wasn't crying. She was just sitting very still, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor, like she was trying to disappear into the carpet through sheer force of will. Garrett knocked softly on the doorframe, and both of them looked up. Mrs. Chen's face was blotchy and wet, her expression cycling rapidly through relief and fury and exhaustion. But Mila's face lit up the moment she saw Bruno, all that careful stillness shattering into pure, uncomplicated joy. "Bruno," she said, and her voice carried the kind of excitement that only children could generate, the ability to pivot from fear to happiness in the space of a heartbeat when something good appeared. Garrett unclipped Bruno's lead, and the shepherd moved forward immediately, his approach slow and gentle, his tail still wagging in those careful, measured sweeps. Mila slid off her chair and dropped to her knees, throwing her small arms around Bruno's neck and burying her face in his fur. "I thought you might be mad at me," she whispered into the dog's shoulder. "I thought my drawing made you sad." Garrett crouched down beside them, bringing himself to Mila's eye level, and Mrs. Chen stood up, moving to her daughter's side, but letting the reunion happen. Letting her child have this moment of connection with the protector who'd understood when no one else had. "Bruno's not mad," Garrett said quietly. "He's very, very proud of you. You did something really brave, Mila." She pulled back from Bruno's fur just enough to look at Garrett, her eyes huge and solemn, in a way no 6-year-old's eyes should ever have to be. "The man in the van scared me," she said. "He was always there, every day when I walked home, and he looked at me funny." Mrs. Chen made a sound like something breaking, her hand moving to her mouth, and Garrett saw fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. He kept his attention on Mila, though, on the little girl who'd carried this fear alone for weeks, because children didn't always have words for the danger they sensed. "I know he did," Garrett said, "and you were right to be scared. Your instincts were telling you something important, and you listened to them. That's really smart." Mila's fingers tangled in Bruno's fur, holding on tight. "But I didn't know who to tell. Mommy was at work, and Mrs. Kowalski doesn't hear so good, and my teacher would say I was making up stories." She paused, then added in a smaller voice, "But I thought maybe Bruno would understand, because he's a police dog, and police dogs help people." Garrett felt his throat tighten, the weight of that simple logic pressing down on him. A child's faith in symbols and uniforms, and the idea that some creatures were built specifically to protect the vulnerable. She'd been right, but she shouldn't have had to seek out a dog to be believed. "Bruno did understand," Garrett said, "and because of your drawing, we found the man who scared you. He's not going to watch you anymore. He's not going to watch any kids anymore. You helped us stop him before he could hurt anyone." Mila's eyes went even wider. "Really? Really?" Garrett glanced up at Mrs. Chen, saw the mother watching her daughter with an expression that mixed pride and grief and lingering terror. You were brave and smart, and you saved yourself. Bruno and I just did the follow-up work. Bruno chose that moment to lick Mila's face, his tongue swiping across her cheek in a long, wet stripe that made the little girl giggle. The first sound of pure childhood happiness Garrett had heard from her since walking into the room. She wiped her face with her sleeve and giggled again, and Mrs. Chen dropped to her knees beside her daughter and pulled her into a crushing hug that Mila melted into without hesitation. "I'm so sorry, baby," Mrs. Chen whispered into Mila's hair. "I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm so sorry you were scared and I wasn't there." "It's okay, Mommy," Mila said, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. "Bruno helped me, and Officer Garrett, and now the man is gone." Garrett stood up slowly, giving them space, and Bruno moved back to his side without needing a command. The shepherd sat down and leaned against Garrett's leg, his weight warm and solid, a reminder that sometimes the best protection came in forms that didn't need words or explanations, just instinct and loyalty and the willingness to listen when someone asked for help in the only language they had. Mrs. Chen looked up at Garrett, her arms still wrapped around Mila. "Thank you," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "Thank you for seeing what she was trying to tell you. Thank you for believing a picture drawn by a scared little girl." Garrett nodded, not trusting his own voice yet, because the truth was, he hadn't seen it. Not at first. Bruno had. The dog had known before any human did that the drawing carried more weight than crayon and paper should hold. The dog had reacted to danger that couldn't be seen or touched, only sensed through channels humans had forgotten how to access. "She's a remarkable kid," Garrett said finally. "You should be proud of her." Chen pulled Mila closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her daughter's head. "I am. God, I am." Patricia Hendricks appeared in the doorway, her expression gentle. "Mrs. Chen, whenever you're ready, you can take Mila home. We've excused her from the rest of the day, and if you need any support resources, counseling, anything, we have information for you." Mrs. Chen nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She stood up slowly, bringing Mila with her, one arm still wrapped protectively around her daughter's shoulders. Mila bent down to hug Bruno one more time, her small arms barely reaching around the shepherd's chest. "Thank you, Bruno," she whispered. "You're the best police dog in the whole world." Bruno's tail wagged harder, and Garrett saw the dog's eyes tracking Mila's movements with the same protective focus he'd shown toward the drawing, understanding somehow that this small human was was important, was worth guarding. Garrett and Bruno walked them out to the parking lot, making sure they got to their car safely, watching as Mrs. Chen buckled Mila into the back seat with hands that still trembled slightly. Before she closed the door, Mila waved at Bruno through the window, her smile bright and trusting and innocent in all the ways childhood was supposed to be. Mrs. Chen paused before getting into the driver's seat, looking at Garrett across the roof of the car. "What happens now? To him?" "He'll be charged," Garrett said. "Multiple counts. The evidence we found." He trailed off, not wanting to detail the photographs and the equipment and the preparations that had been documented in that van, not wanting to put images in a mother's head that would never leave. "He won't see the outside of a prison for a very long time. Maybe never." She nodded slowly, something fierce flickering across her face. "Good." Then she was in the car, pulling out of the lot, taking her daughter home to safety and familiar walls, and all the normal routines that would hopefully feel normal again someday. Garrett stood there with Bruno beside him, watching until the car disappeared around the corner. The afternoon sun was warm on his shoulders, the playground behind them echoing with children's voices as recess continued in blissful ignorance of how close one of their classmates had come to vanishing into statistics and headlines. Bruno leaned against his leg again, and Garrett's hand dropped to the dog's head, fingers scratching behind velvet ears. "You did good, partner," he said quietly. "You did real good." The shepherd looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes that had seen danger in crayon marks, that had refused to ignore what humans might have dismissed, that had trusted instinct over logic, and been absolutely right. And Garrett thought about Mila's drawing, still bagged as evidence back at the precinct. Thought about stick figures and partial license plates and black crayon eyes pressed hard enough to tear paper. thought about how sometimes the smallest voices carried the most important warnings, if anyone bothered to listen. Bruno had listened, and because of that, a little girl would grow up, would walk home from school tomorrow and the day after and all the days that followed without a white van watching from the shadows, would get to keep her innocence just a little longer, keep her trust in the world intact enough to heal from the fear she'd carried. That was worth everything. The precinct briefing room felt different when Garrett walked into it 2 days later. Same fluorescent lights, same scuffed linoleum floors, same bulletin boards covered in patrol schedules and department memos that nobody read unless their name appeared in bold. But the air carried a different weight now, the kind that settled over a station house after something big got prevented instead of just responded to, saved instead of mourned. Lydia stood at the front of the room, beside a screen displaying Vickers's booking photo and a summary of the charges filed against him. Attempted kidnapping, stalking of a minor, multiple counts related to the surveillance equipment and materials found in the van. The list went on longer than Garrett wanted to read, each line representing another piece of intent that had been building towards something unspeakable. "Carl Vickers is being held without bail," Lydia said to the assembled officers, her voice carrying the professional tone she used during official briefings. "The DA's office expects additional charges as the investigation continues. His computer equipment is being analyzed by forensics, and early indications suggest Mila Chen wasn't his first target, just his most recent." She paused, letting that sink in. "We're working with agencies in 3 other counties to cross-reference missing children cases from the past 5 years. Garrett felt something cold settle in his stomach. The photographs in the van, the methodical planning, the patience Vickers had shown while studying Mila's routine. None of it suggested a first attempt. None of it matched the profile of someone who just recently decided to start hunting children. Bruno shifted beside Garrett's chair, the shepherd's presence a warm, solid anchor against the implications spreading through the room like oil on water. How many other children, how many other families, how many cases that had gone cold might suddenly have a name to attach to the nightmare? "Here's what matters right now," Lydia continued, and her expression softened just slightly. "We stopped him. He's off the streets. And the reason we stopped him is because a 6-year-old girl was brave enough to document what scared her, and because Officer Garrett and Canine Bruno took that documentation seriously." She looked directly at Garrett. "That's good police work. That's exactly what we're supposed to do. Listen to the people who need us, even when they can't ask for help in traditional ways." A few officers nodded. Torres raised his coffee cup in a small salute from the back row. McKinnon gave Garrett a thumbs up that carried genuine respect behind it. Garrett felt the recognition settle over him like a coat that didn't quite fit right, because he knew the truth. He'd almost dismissed the drawing, had almost written it off as a child's overactive imagination, translating a repair van or delivery truck into something threatening, had almost filed it away in the mental category of things that were touching but not urgent. Bruno had been the one to understand. Bruno had been the one who'd refused to let it go. After the briefing ended, Garrett walked to the evidence room and signed out Mila's drawing. The original would stay locked up until trial, but he'd requested a color photocopy for the station's community outreach board, the section where they posted success stories and positive contacts that reminded everyone why the job mattered when the overtime and the bureaucracy and the budget cuts made it hard to remember. He stared at the photocopy in his hands, at Mila's careful crayon work and the stick figures and the license plate letters she'd gotten exactly right, at the black eyes pressed hard enough to tear through to the truth beneath. "She'll be okay, you know?" Lydia's voice came from behind him, and Garrett turned to find his sergeant leaning against the doorframe. "Kids are resilient. She had a scare, but she also had a win. She'll remember that she was smart and brave and that asking for help worked." Garrett nodded slowly. "Her mom's getting her into counseling, just to make sure." "Good." Lydia moved closer, glancing down at the drawing. "You planning to tell her? Mila, I mean, when she's older? Tell her what Bruno did?" Garrett thought about that, imagined Mila at 16, at 20, at whatever age people started understanding how close the edges of safety really were. Imagined her learning that a police dog had read danger in her childhood artwork, and it set in motion the chain of events that saved her life. Maybe, he said quietly, or maybe I'll just let her keep believing that police dogs are magic, that they understand things humans miss, that they're built to protect kids who need protecting. They are, though, Lydia said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she wasn't entirely joking. Magic might be the wrong word for it, but instinct that good, training that solid, a bond between handler and canine strong enough that the dog knows when something matters, even if the human doesn't see it yet. She shrugged. That's close enough to magic for me. Garrett looked down at Bruno, at the shepherd sitting patiently at his side, with those intelligent brown eyes tracking every movement in the hallway, waiting for the next command, ready for the next call, loyal in the way only dogs knew how to be, complete and unconditional and unwavering. Yeah, Garrett said. Close enough. That evening, after shift ended, and the patrol units had been checked back in and the reports had been filed, Garrett took Bruno to the park near the precinct. Not the training grounds where they ran drills and practiced building searches. Just the regular public park where people walked their pets and kids played on swings, and the world went about its business in blissful ignorance of how thin the line between safety and danger really was. He threw a tennis ball for Bruno, watching the shepherd chase it down with the same intensity he brought to tracking suspects and searching vehicles. Total commitment. No half measures. Everything Bruno did, he did completely. The ball came back wet with dog saliva, and Garrett threw it again, his mind replaying the past 48 hours in fragments. Vickers being led out of the precinct in handcuffs, his face carefully blank. Mrs. Chen's voice breaking over the phone when Garrett had called to update her on the charges. Mila's small arms wrapping around Bruno's neck in absolute trust that the dog would keep her safe. Sometimes the job was traffic stops and noise complaints and paperwork that buried you alive in triplicate forms. Sometimes it was standing in hospital hallways, waiting to hear if someone would make it, or staring at crime scenes that rewrote your understanding of what humans were capable of doing to each other. But sometimes it was this: a little girl who got to stay safe, a predator who wouldn't hunt anyone else's child, a canine partner whose instincts had bridged the gap between what could be proven and what needed to be believed. Bruno brought the ball back one more time and dropped it at Garrett's feet, then sat down and leaned against his leg the way he always did when the play was over and it was time to just exist together in the quiet spaces between action. Garrett's hand found the soft fur behind Bruno's ears, scratching in the spot that made the dog's back leg kick slightly. "We did good, partner," he said softly. The same words he'd said at the school, the same sentiment that felt more true every time he repeated it. "We did real good." Bruno's tail thumped against the grass, and somewhere across the park, a child laughed. Bright and careless and innocent in all the ways that childhood was supposed to be. The sound carried on the evening air like a promise that some things were still worth protecting, that some victories mattered more than recognition or medals or commendations that would gather dust in a drawer somewhere. Garrett picked up the tennis ball one last time and threw it into the fading light, watching Bruno sprint after it with tireless joy, watching his partner do what he was born to do: protect, serve, listen to the voices that needed hearing, even when they came in crayon on folded paper.